Somewhere in Europe, there are family names that used to mean something no one remembers anymore. Not wealth, not fame. Something older than both. A place in a bloodline that once decided who ruled, who prayed, who inherited land, and who was permitted to marry whom. Most of that meaning has been erased by time, war, migration, and the slow forgetting that happens to almost everything human beings once considered sacred. But erasure on paper is not the same as erasure in biology, because tucked inside certain surnames, plain, unremarkable, easy to overlook, researchers have found something that should not have survived. A genetic thread run quietly through father after father, century after century, connecting ordinary people alive today to dynasties, priesthoods, and founding lineages that history books assumed had simply dissolved into the general population. They had not dissolved, they had gone quiet, and DNA was the only thing patient enough to notice. For most of European history, a surname was treated as a modern convenience, something that hardened into permanent form only in the medieval and early modern periods, largely for practical reasons: taxation, land inheritance, military conscription, church record-keeping. Before that, historians assumed identity was fluid. A man might be known by his father's name, his village, his trade, or his lord. Bloodlines beyond 2 or 3 generations back were, in the standard telling, essentially unrecoverable, lost to fire, war, illiteracy, and the simple fact that most people never had their existence written down at all. This was the accepted picture for a long time: surnames as shallow, recent, culturally invented labels with no deep biological memory behind them. Interesting for genealogists chasing land records, meaningless for anyone hoping to reach further back into the world before written surnames existed at all. It was a reasonable assumption. It also turned out to be incomplete. The first crack appeared in an unlikely place, not a castle or a cathedral, but a laboratory studying an entirely different question. Researchers investigating Y chromosome diversity noticed that certain surnames, especially rarer ones tied to specific regions, showed far less genetic variation among unrelated-seeming men than random chance should allow. Statistically, that should not happen if a surname were just a cultural label, passed down independently of biology, accumulating new fathers, new bloodlines, and new genetic noise with every generation. Instead, some names behaved almost like fossils, frozen, preserved, carrying the same molecular signature across dozens of generations, and in a few remarkable cases across more than 1,000 years. Something was moving through these families that was not written down anywhere, something the church records, the land deeds, and even the oral family legends had no way of confirming or denying. That is where science had to step carefully into the story, because the tool involved is unusual, and its power comes from a very specific biological quirk. The Y chromosome, found only in men, passes from father to son with almost no alteration, generation after generation, changing only through the slow accumulation of random mutations. It does not mix the way the rest of the genome does. It does not dilute. In lineages where surnames also pass from father to son, researchers realized they were sitting on 2 independent record-keeping systems, moving in parallel, one cultural, written in parish ledgers, and one biological, written in chromosomes, and for certain names, those 2 systems told strikingly matching stories, reaching back centuries further than any surviving document could verify. That should have been the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning. Because when researchers began comparing these Y chromosome signatures more broadly across regions, religions, and social classes, the results did not simply confirm tidy, noble bloodlines quietly persisting underground. They revealed something far messier and far more interesting. The story did not collapse into a single simple answer. It widened. In some surname groups, the shared genetic signal pointed toward a single, spectacularly successful medieval or ancient patriarch whose descendants multiplied across centuries until his chromosome and his name saturated an entire region. In others, the same surname carried multiple unrelated genetic lineages entirely, meaning the name itself had been adopted independently in different places by different unrelated families for entirely unrelated reasons, a shared label with no shared blood behind it at all. And in a smaller, stranger category, researchers found genetic signals that did not match the documented history of the surname whatsoever, suggesting a hidden substitution somewhere along the line, an unrecorded adoption, an unacknowledged birth, a name inherited without the biology that was supposed to accompany it. Three very different stories, all hiding behind the same kind of evidence, and separating them required more than a hunch, it required data. Three explanatory frameworks emerged from this research, and each one applied differently depending on the surname in question. The first is founder amplification, a single man, often protected by status, land, or religious privilege, producing an outsized number of surviving male descendants who each carried his surname and his Y chromosome forward together, generation after generation, until the signal became statistically unmistakable centuries later. The second is parallel adoption, a surname arising independently in multiple unrelated families, often because it described something common, like a trade, a landscape feature, or a patronymic pattern so widespread that dozens of unconnected men ended up with identical names purely by coincidence, never sharing ancestry at all. The third is quiet substitution, cases where the paper record and the biological record diverge, revealing a moment, usually unrecorded and unremarked upon at the time, where a name continued forward into history while the bloodline beneath it quietly changed. None of these frameworks is inherently more dramatic than the others, but one category of finding, when it appeared, tended to draw the most attention, because it connected an ordinary surname to something extraordinary. The most cited and carefully scrutinized example in this field involves a surname tradition tied not to nobility in the political sense, but to priesthood, a hereditary religious office within Jewish communities, traditionally passed from father to son, associated with surnames like Cohen, Khan, and their many regional variants. When researchers analyzed Y chromosome markers among men carrying this hereditary priestly designation across geographically and culturally separated Jewish communities in the Middle East, Europe, and North Africa, they found something researchers did not fully expect going in: a shared genetic signature, present at notably higher frequency among these men than among the general Jewish population, consistent with descent from a much smaller number of paternal ancestors, at a depth of time that roughly aligned with the biblical and historical era in which this hereditary priesthood is traditionally said to have originated. This finding does not prove a single-named individual founded the line. Researchers remain appropriately cautious about that leap. But it does suggest that an oral and religious tradition, one entirely independent of modern genetics, describing patrilineal inheritance across thousands of years, had preserved something real enough to leave a detectable genetic trace, separated communities, isolated from each other for over 1,000 years by geography, persecution, and migration, still carrying a shared paternal signal that matched their shared oral history almost precisely. Not the outcome anyone expected walking in. Not a confirmation of royal blood, but of something arguably rarer, an unbroken religious lineage, verified not by scripture or tradition alone, but by chromosomes. A parallel and equally striking case emerged from a very different direction: ancient DNA extracted directly from the remains of early medieval European elites, including burials associated with the Merovingian dynasty, the Frankish royal line that dominated much of early medieval Western Europe. When researchers sequenced DNA recovered from remains linked to this dynasty and compared it against broader ancient and modern European datasets, the results complicated the simple assumption that early medieval kings represented a single, unified Frankish genetic population. Instead, the genetic picture showed layered ancestry, consistent with a ruling elite whose bloodline already blended multiple earlier European populations well before the dynasty rose to power. A reminder that even the DNA of kings does not trace back to one pure origin point, but to centuries of prior mixing that the crown itself never erased. That was not a contradiction of noble ancestry. It was a signal that nobility, even at its most powerful, was never genetically singular to begin with. What both of these cases point toward is a bigger idea, one that reaches far beyond any individual surname or dynasty. Human lineage, even among the most carefully documented, most socially guarded families in history, was never a clean single thread. It was layered from the very beginning, built from waves of migration, conquest, intermarriage, religious law, and quiet, unrecorded human choices that no legal document was ever going to capture. The idea of a pure bloodline, whether royal, priestly, or otherwise, turns out to be less a biological reality and more a story people told themselves to make sense of continuity in a world that was, underneath the surface, constantly mixing.